Have you ever wondered how a document written over 2 centuries ago still dictates the rhythm of American politics today? It's not just about the big, flashy amendments we all know. The real story, the one that truly shaped America's future, is hidden in the quiet compromises, the heated debates, and the very structure of the US Constitution. This isn't just a history lesson. It's the origin story of our modern political world. Let's travel back to 1787. The United States wasn't so united. The first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was failing spectacularly. The country was broke, states were squabbling like siblings, and some were even printing their own money. It was chaos. So 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia, not to tweak the old system, but to perform a political miracle, create a nation from scratch. Their biggest fear, tyranny. They had just fought a war to escape a king, and they were terrified of creating a new one. But they also feared anarchy, the chaos they were currently living in. The entire debate was a tightrope walk between these two fears. This is where the first quiet, yet monumental, decision was made. The separation of powers. They didn't just create a government. They created 3 competing branches. A legislative branch, Congress, to make laws, an executive branch, the President, to enforce them, and a judicial branch, the Supreme Court, to interpret them. This wasn't just a clever design. It was a deliberate act of embedding conflict into the heart of the government. They wanted these branches to be ambitious, to check each other, to fight for power. That constant tension, that gridlock we often complain about today. It's not a bug. It's a feature. It was designed to slow things down, to prevent any one person or group from gaining too much control too quickly. Then came the Great Compromise. The big states, like Virginia, wanted representation in Congress based on population. More people, more power. Makes sense, right? But the small states, like Delaware and New Jersey, were terrified. They knew they'd be completely bulldozed by the larger states. They threatened to walk out, to go back to chaos, or even to ally with foreign powers. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. For weeks, the convention was on the brink of collapse. Then a compromise emerged. A 2-house legislature. The House of Representatives would be based on population, pleasing the big states. But the Senate would give every state 2 votes, regardless of size, protecting the small states. This decision quietly echoed through history. It created a system where a state like Wyoming, with 500,000 people, has the same power in the Senate as California, with nearly 40 million. This has profoundly shaped American policy, giving rural and less populated states a disproportionate say on everything from judicial appointments to federal legislation. The Electoral College, which we'll get to, is a direct descendant of this same fear of being dominated by population centers. But as they debated representation, a dark and terrible question emerged. What about the enslaved people? The southern states wanted to count them for the purpose of getting more representatives in the House, which would give them more political power. But they certainly didn't want to treat them as people with rights. The northern states were horrified by the hypocrisy. The result was one of the most infamous compromises in American history, the 3/5 compromise. For purposes of representation, each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person. This wasn't just a mathematical formula. It was a moral stain that embedded the institution of slavery into the nation's founding document. It gave the South an outsized influence in the federal government for decades, protecting slavery and ultimately paving the road to the Civil War. The Constitution never uses the word slave, instead using euphemisms like other persons, a quiet, deliberate choice that shows just how deeply uncomfortable the framers were, even as they enshrined this brutal system. Now, let's talk about the president. The framers were deeply suspicious of executive power. Remember, King George III was fresh in their minds. Some delegates argued for a weak executive council, while others, like Alexander Hamilton, wanted a strong, almost king-like figure elected for life. The debate raged on. What they settled on was a single president, but one with limited powers and subject to checks and balances. And how would this powerful figure be chosen? Not by a direct popular vote. The framers didn't trust the common person to make such a critical decision. They feared mob rule. They worried that a charismatic demagogue could sweep into power on a wave of popular passion. So they created the Electoral College. It was another compromise, a strange, indirect system where citizens vote for electors who then cast the actual votes for president. This was intended as a buffer between the people and the presidency. They imagined electors as wise, discerning men who could exercise their own judgment, even overriding the popular will if necessary to prevent a disaster. Of course, that's not how it works today. Electors almost always vote with their state's popular vote, but the structure remains. And it's the reason why a candidate can win the popular vote nationwide, but still lose the presidency. This has happened 5 times in US history, and it continues to be one of the most controversial and politically charged features of the constitutional system. A quiet decision from 1787 that continues to spark loud debates today. Finally, after months of secret, grueling debate, they had a document. But it was missing something crucial, a list of individual rights. Many delegates believed these rights were already implied, that the government was only given specific, enumerated powers. So it couldn't trample on rights it wasn't authorized to touch. But others, like George Mason of Virginia, refused to sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. He and others feared that this new, powerful federal government would eventually overstep its bounds. The debate spilled out into the public ratification process. To win support for the new Constitution, the Federalist supporters had to promise that the very first thing the new Congress would do is add a Bill of Rights. And they did. The first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights protect our most fundamental freedoms: speech, religion, the press, and the right to a fair trial. But even here, the language was broad and open-ended. What exactly is freedom of speech? Does it cover everything? What constitutes an unreasonable search and seizure? The framers didn't give us a detailed instruction manual. They gave us principles. And they did something truly revolutionary. They included a process to amend the Constitution. They knew they couldn't predict the future. They knew the country would change in ways they couldn't even imagine. So they built in a mechanism for future generations to adapt the document to new realities. This is perhaps the Constitution's most profound and quiet legacy. It wasn't meant to be a static, unchanging tablet of stone. It was designed to be a living document, a conversation across centuries. The vague language and the amendment process ensured that the debates that started in Philadelphia in 1787 would never truly end. Every time the Supreme Court makes a landmark ruling, every time we argue about the balance of power between the President and Congress, every time we debate the meaning of our fundamental rights, we are continuing the conversation the framers started. The Constitution didn't just shape America's political past. It quietly built the very arena where we argue about its future. It's a story that is still being written by all of us. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into America's political DNA interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. See you next time.